Null, as some of you might know, but all of you should know, is a scholar, one of the best theologians and historians in the field of the English Reformation on today's globe. I speak from experience, since we have worked together in Germany for nearly a quarter of a century, in Tübingen, in Berlin, and since 2022, in the context of the Wittenberg Center of Reformation Studies, a very special creature with which he had been pregnant for years, and to which he finally gave birth, with Andreas Stegmann as co-parent and midwife, me being the godmother. Fortunately, Dr. Null promised he would continue to dedicate half of his time and energy to his academic work of research and teaching. Yes, fortunately indeed, for he is not only one of the best historians of the English Reformation, but also for the time being one of the last. At least when history of the Reformation means more than social history or the history of emotions to which it has come down more or less today. Dear Right Reverend, I will hold you, where are you? I will hold you to your promise. Godmother is watching. Dr. Null's historical and theological work circles around one man and his legacy. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury under the kings Henry VIII and Edward VI, the reformer of the English Church and one of its martyrs. He knows this Archbishop's biography, his handwriting, and his theology inward out. His own theology is strongly influenced by him. His liturgical awareness is shaped by Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer, as we shall experience tomorrow. But what he did not foresee is that one day he would follow in Thomas Cranmer's footsteps also in another respect by becoming a bishop himself, a bishop of the Anglican Church. That's why the organizers of this happy reunion asked me to reflect on the episcopal office in a historical and theological perspective. Not in an overall perspective, but on the episcopal office in the Reformation, more precisely in the Reformation in Germany and in England. In modern terms, in the Lutheran and the Anglican Reformation. Such a comparative approach reflects our common work in the Wittenberg Center. But it is also historically and theologically adequate. After all, the English Reformation was deeply influenced by the Reformation on the European continent, in some respects more so by its Swiss Reformed branch, in others by the Lutheran branch. In some respects, in others by the Lutheran branch. One of the common features common to the Lutheran and the Anglican Reformation is that both upheld an episcopal model of church structure. In this respect, they both differed, and the respective churches still do, from the concept of the Swiss Reformed churches, Calvin, John Knox, and so on, who stated that the Christian church should rather do without bishops. According to the Swiss Reformed view, the ideal church structure is, on all its levels, strictly synodical. The highest governing body of the church is a synod of pastors and elders, just as the parishes are governed by a pastor together with a number of elders, apart from intermediate level structures in the same way. The Lutheran and the Anglican models, on the other hand, are monarchical. To be clear, this does not mean that they have no synods and other structures of communion, but they assign a special role, and in some respects the last word, to an individual, to the pastor on the parish level, and to a bishop on the highest level, In this regard, they carry on the church structure of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. However, continuity regarding the episcopal office in these two cases is only one side of the coin. At the same time, the Reformation in all its branches led to considerable structural modifications, and it brought about fundamental changes in the theological understanding of the episcopal office. Before I concentrate on these modifications and changes, let me say a general word about the historical contexts in which they took place. In all of Western Christianity at the time, and in large parts in the East as well, the episcopal office was part of the political make-up of the different realms. Nearly all states were monarchies, and there was no separation between church and state, of political constitution and religious confession as we know it today. The bishops were columns on which the monarchs relied not only spiritually, but also for their political business. You might know the famous saying of King James I, decades after the Reformation in Protestant England: "No bishops, no kings." James, who was deeply convinced of the divine rights of kings, directed those words, "no bishops, no kings," against Calvinist demands for synodical structures. Structural changes in this direction for the king would have meant a threat to the monarchical order itself. You could find the same conviction rooted deeply in the Middle Ages throughout the European monarchies. In Lutheran Scandinavia, they led to very similar developments like in England. In the Holy Roman Empire, loosely speaking in Germany, the marriage of monarchy, in this case imperial monarchy, and episcopacy had a particular shape. All bishops and archbishops of the empire were at the same time princes, rulers of their own territories, on a par with the other princes of the empire, dukes, knights, kings, and others of this kind. As such, as princes, they held the majority of seats and special rights in the Reichstag, the imperial diet, and they were decisive in the electoral body that elected the emperor. Thus, the whole structure of the Holy Roman Empire was dependent on the political status of the bishops. No bishops, no emperor, one could say. And in fact, the moment the bishops lost their principalities, their political status, in the wake of the French Revolution, early 19th century, the Holy Roman Empire as such collapsed. It was immediately linked. Why have I described these political contexts at such length? Because they show that the development of the episcopal office was not simply an ecclesial or theological matter. To a large extent, it depended also on historical political circumstances. Loosely speaking, whenever the Reformation in countries with a monarchical order won over the monarch, the episcopal system was preserved, modified of course, but preserved. When the Reformation did not succeed in winning over the ruler, the king also, and so on, but had to be carried out against him and his bishops, a synodical system without bishops was introduced. This was the case in France, in Scotland, or also in Poland. On the long run, this was in most cases not successful, but this was the course of events. In non-monarchical states, like the city-states of Switzerland or the Dutch republics, there was no question of evangelical bishops. The Holy Roman Empire is a special case because of its very special structure. For it consisted of units, dukedoms, kingdoms, and so on, which were largely independent, but not completely independent. After all, there was the emperor and the imperial diet. The princes of those units were strong enough to introduce the Reformation if they wanted to. In fact, most of them did. But the emperor did not, and since his power depended to such a large extent on the prince-bishops and their political status, he was adamant about keeping them on his side. There was no way to get rid of them or replace them with evangelical bishops. Thus, the German Lutherans had to find a special solution, as we shall see, because they nevertheless kept the monarchical system. And since they met with such difficulties, they were forced to reflect on the nature of the episcopal office with particular intensity. So it was not all politics. Therefore, let us now look at the theological arguments. I'll start with Martin Luther because he was the first reformer to reflect on the nature of episcopacy, and among the reformers, he presented the most principled deliberations on this topic and the most influential ones, influential also in England. In one of his earliest statements, Luther wrote, "According to the will of Christ and the apostles, every city should have a pastor or a bishop, as St. Paul clearly states in his letter to Titus. For a bishop and a pastor are one and the same thing in St. Paul, as St. Jerome also proves. But the bishops we have now, diocesan bishops, are unknown to Scripture. They were installed later by Christian congregations so that one pastor should rule over many, but it was not so from the beginning. However, as the apostle also said, a pastor or bishop, which is the same, should have several elders or presbyters alongside him who would help him rule the flock and the congregation with preaching and sacraments." This quotation contains and implies a number of statements to which Luther adhered and which became part of the confessional documents of the Lutheran Church. Episcopal office is one of many terms for the fundamental apostolic ministry of the Church, namely the task of administrating the sacraments and of preaching the gospel, including pastoral care. Where does such activity take place? In the parish. The local congregation gathered around one pulpit, one font, and one communion table. That is to say, the episcopal office in essence is none other than the office of the parish pastor. Indeed, the pastor of a parish, of a congregation, holds the primary office of the Church of Christ. For this statement, Luther quotes the pastoral letters of the New Testament. He also likes to refer to the church fathers, like Jerome or also St. Augustine, who regarding his ministry was nothing but the local pastor in the little city of Hippo. Quotation, "In the ancient church, every city had a bishop just as we have now parish pastors, as St. Augustine, who was ordained by his bishop Valerius, and later, after his death, became a bishop himself, had no larger parish than ours here in Wittenberg. Indeed, it was smaller than the Wittenberg parish." Luther could also have cited Bishop Cyprian of Carthage, whose place you have visited today. In fact, a parish pastor of a still smaller flock. However, the deeper and fundamental reason for this identification of bishop and pastor does not lie in this or that biblical reference or patristic quotation. It rather lies in the nature of the Church's ministry itself. The ministry of the Church entrusted to it by Christ is none other than the ministry of preaching the good news and administering the sacraments. And it is therefore primarily realized where such preaching and administration of the sacrament continuously takes place within the individual congregation. Against this background, it is of secondary importance how this ministry is named. Since the New Testament and the ancient Church used the word bishop in this context, which actually simply meant overseer or superintendent and had no religious meaning at all, it is appropriate to follow their terminology. Thus, at the same time, the original Christian usage of the term comes back into currency. This view found expression in the first Lutheran liturgy of ordination. In the Wittenberg Ordinal from 1533, the ordination of pastors is designed according to the consecration of bishops as prescribed in early Christian sources. The readings are 1 Timothy 3 and Acts 20, which deal with the ordination of, in fact, ministers. The admonition which follows addresses the ordinants as future bishops, and the laying on of hands is done by the pastors, bishops of the neighboring cities. It is the neighboring bishops, as prescribed for the episcopal consecrations by the Council of Nicaea, where it says when a new bishop comes into office, 3 neighboring bishops, alias city pastors, should come together and together lay hands on him. They are entitled to do so as the holders of the one true ministry of the Christian Church of preaching and administration of the sacraments. Through them, the ordinants enter into a line of episcopal succession. The thought of succession, however, did not play an important role in this concept. In fact, it was marginal in all churches and theological traditions in the 16th, 17th century. It became important and prominent only much, much later, also in the Roman Catholic Church. It didn't play a big role in the 16th century. For the Wittenberg theologians, the important notion was faithfulness in the transmission of the gospel in accordance with the New Testament, an apostolic succession of preaching and teaching. The ritual succession from pastor bishop to pastor bishop could only serve as an instrument for this decisive succession. Notwithstanding all this, the Lutheran Reformation in no way rejected an episcopal office above the parish level as such. Luther wished that acting bishops would join the Reformation, as happened, for instance, in Scandinavia, and he worked for the establishment of a Lutheran diocesan episcopacy in the empire. Before following this aspect further, it must be emphasized, however, that the affirmation and eventual formation of episcopal structures above the parish level in no way altered the principle that the apostolic ministry in the Church is the office of parish pastor, serving a congregation gathered around one pulpit, one font, and one table of communion with word and sacrament. All higher level offices rest entirely on this fundamental office. In them, certain functions which essentially are implied in the task of preaching and administering sacraments are, so to speak, disincorporated. The bishop above the parish level, the diocesan bishop, is in essence a pastor, a bishop according to the original usage of the word. A pastor whose peculiar duty is to realize a certain aspect implied in the apostolic ministry as such. What is this aspect? It is the universality of the Church. The gospel is not the possession of one congregation only. Although the word is preached to a specific group of people, and the Lord's Supper is always distributed to a specific congregation, it is the same salvific message to the whole Church. The Creed calls this aspect the Church's Catholicity, which is rooted in the Catholicity of the gospel itself. This Catholicity or universality, for several reasons, needs specific care. What are these reasons? They are natural reasons. No individual believer, no individual parish, no individual minister could ever exhaust and unfold the universal significance of the gospel. Every one of them, every one of us, have their different perspectives, limited in and directed at certain spaces and certain times. So the universality of the gospel in Africa, in England, in Germany might make shine different aspects of this one gospel, which can only be seen if people of such different perspectives come together. So the universality of the Church obviously needs special care in this respect. It also needs special care for moral reasons. No individual minister, no individual believer, no individual congregation is free from egocentricity, from the danger of using the gospel for his own position or his own for own rewards for him or herself. So therefore also we need means and structures who take care of universality against such dangers. And finally, there are spiritual needs. No individual congregation, no individual believer, no individual minister is free from making mistakes. Mistakes in teaching of doctrinal as well as moral issues. So therefore, we need to take care of the universality of the gospel also in light of such problems. And finally, all individual preachers, teachers, congregations need the spiritual support of others, at times including material support. For all these reasons, the Catholicity or universality of the Church needs instruments for its implementation. Instruments which finally have to serve the primary business of the Church on the level of the parishes, but nevertheless have to be taken care of. This conviction that the universality or the Catholicity of the Church needs certain structures, certain instruments and means to take care of this dimension of the Church is a common conviction of all the reformers. Among the classical reformers, you don't find any congregationalist, no ecclesiology that thinks the parish or the congregation it can be self-sufficient. All of them think we need special structures to safeguard the universality of the Church. Although then they follow up this thought in different ways. What are the possible instruments on the table? First, the first and original one is visits. The visits between congregations, between the leader of congregations, to strengthen each other, to get information about each other, and so on. Out of these visits, which we had very, very early on in the Church, grew out the visitation, which in fact originally is a visit from one side, from one minister or one congregation to the other. Another means of the implementation of Catholicity are the synods or councils, meeting of representatives of many parishes coming together to solve certain problems or regularly to speak about common issues. And the third means of implementation of universality are individuals with special responsibility Later on, they were the episcopal bishops growing out of the original structure of having parish bishops. Some of these bishops, especially those of the more important cities, received special responsibilities, special powers for the governing of the church. For instance, convocation of synods, leading of consecrations or of ordinations, and so on. So all these means serve to support the church, serve to have oversight, at times also serve to disciplining certain individuals or certain congregations within the wider church. But in choosing which of these means, which of these structures would be most appropriate, the reformers differed. All of them, as I said, were of the opinion that the church needed structural instruments, but which of them were most appropriate, they gave different answers here. What was different between them was first their choice of certain instruments of Catholicity, and secondly, the principal weight they thought their instruments had. What does it mean? Reformed Calvinist theologians like Calvin himself, John Knox and so on, said the church should have synodical structures as the best possible structures to hold the church together and to implement its Catholicity. This was common to all Calvinist and Reformed theologians. They did differ, however, in the importance they gave to this decision. Some of them said the church should have synods as their basic structure, like Calvin, but Calvin didn't say the church had to have this. It would be best if they had only synods and no bishops. But if there are some bishops, some Calvinist churches which had bishops, okay, that's the second best solution, but it's possible. So, for instance, in Hungary, in Poland, and later on, although forced upon them, in Scotland. Other Reformed theologians like John Knox, however, and the English Puritans, the later Puritans, insisted the church had to have only synods and no bishops. It was a matter of the essence of the church. So they differed. Lutheran and English reformers found the best structure of the church would be episcopal. Episcopal in the sense of having also diocesan bishops above the parish level. It was the structure which was very early there in the church, and it would best serve the present situation of the churches, at least in all monarchical contexts. None of them, however, neither the English reformers nor the German reformers, came to the conclusion to say that the church had to have bishops, so that the essence of the church required the episcopal office. They all were convinced it would be best if the church had bishops, but if they had another structure, it still didn't make them still didn't unchurch them. In other words, the episcopacy was good for the bene esse of the church, for the well-being of the church, but it was not necessary for the essence of the church. Let me quickly finish the Lutheran business before I come to the English side. As I said before, it was impossible in the Holy Roman Empire that a bishop could join the Reformation. At the same time, very early on, the Wittenberg reformers and others saw that the congregations which had joined the Reformation needed mutual support, they needed oversight. So they created intermediary structures which eventually could be superseded by the classical episcopal ones. They introduced superintendents. And this was quite clever, because superintendent is just the Latin translation of bishop. Bishop meaning episkopos, the overseer, and in Latin, this is superintendent. So they introduced regional bishops named superintendents, whose task was ordination, disciplining of individual pastors, and holding visitations. They would have liked also to have a bishop on the higher level, on the level of dioceses and so on, but as I said, this was not possible. So on the long run, they found a special interim way out. They said our princes are our regional or our diocesan bishops, as long as we don't have ordained bishops. So all the Lutheran princes became interim bishops of the Lutheran churches. That was a solution very similar to the position of the English monarch as supreme governor of the church, but in fact the princes in Germany then played the role of the supreme governor of the church in England, the difference being that this solution of having the queen or the king as supreme governor of the church was a solution forever, whereas in Germany it was always clear this should only be an interim solution. But as you know, provisional solutions tend to be everlasting ones. And thus, only when the monarchy fell, this construction came to an end. And when did this construction fall? When we had no princes anymore. After the First World War, all the princes, all the monarchs and so on had to go. So from this moment on, it was possible to have bishops, diocesan bishops, who were ordained and not politicians anymore. Nevertheless, although since then we have ecclesial bishops in the Lutheran churches from that time on, there was never the question to deny the ministry, the validity of the ministry to churches which have no bishops. So the Lutheran churches never said, Reformed churches, for instance, who have no bishops but only synods, would not be fully church. So the solution is always, it's better to have bishops, but if you don't have them, it's not really a matter of being church or not. Now let's jump across the channel to England. In England, there was never a realistic possibility of abolishing the episcopal system. After all, the highest bishop led the Reformation, Thomas Cranmer, together with other bishops. For the monarchs of England, it was as clear as for the Holy Roman Empire. There had to be bishops, no kings. On the other hand, there were strong demands by the Calvinist, Reformed, or Puritan theologians to complete the English Reformation by abolishing episcopacy and instead introducing synodal structures. I don't know whether if Edward had lived longer, in the end these voices would have prevailed. I doubt it. Dr. Null would know better about this. But of course, under Elizabeth, there was absolutely no thought about such things. The settlement, Elizabethan settlement of 1559, made it clear the English church was and was to be a church with bishop. At the same time, there was far less principal reflection on the side of those who upheld the episcopal system, what this meant theologically and ecclesiologically. The 39 articles about which we've heard before have very much like the Lutheran Confession, very briefly spoken of the ministry of preaching the gospel and administering the sacraments to the congregation. Full stop, nothing else. Bishops are not even mentioned in the 39 articles in the Lutheran confessions. They are mentioned, but not in the English ones. They were there as a matter of fact. There was no need to say more about it. The bishop, of course, became a topic in the ordinal which has a chapter on the consecration of bishops. There it is said, the new bishop has to be asked, quotation, to stir up the grace of God which is in thee, quotation. That means the conferment, that means consecration is not the conferment of an additional grace on top of the grace conferred at ordination. The Holy Spirit is asked to help for making use of the grace of ordination for a very special task, is not conferred to give a special higher degree of higher grace. Beyond this, I said there's very little principal ecclesiological reflection on the bishops or the other ministries' nature. There's little, but there is not nothing. Richard Hooker, the most important theologian of England in the 16th century, in his famous Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, speaks about the order, right in the beginning, about the synodical order of Geneva, saying, this is not very good to have it over here. In Geneva, it might be the right order, not so much because it is God-given, but because it is fitting to the circumstances of that great city. This means, by implication, in England, with its different circumstances, bishops will be more fitting. Quotation, what may be profitable to the churches in France and in Geneva would be most hurtful to this Church of England. This morning we heard, in the former lecture, we heard about local adaptation. That's in fact what Hooker said about the bishops, the episcopal bishop. That's also a matter of adaptation. Either you have it or you don't have it, according to the circumstances in which you live. John Whitgift, Queen Elizabeth's longest-serving Bishop of Canterbury, who eventually would crown her successor James I, explicitly supported this same view. In a monarchical society like England, the episcopal order was meet and right. This meant, as Whitgift, Hooker, and others underlined, the episcopal order greatly contributed to the well-being of the Church, at least in England. But in no way it was part of the being, the essence of the Church. So it belonged to the bene esse, not to the esse. In this principal sense, the episcopal as well as the synodical order was an adiaphoron. You could have it or you could not have it. In this principal sense, you could still say it was better to have the one or the other, but it was not a matter of the churches being the church. In this essential sense, it was an adiaphoron, a thing you could have or you could not have. This theological or ecclesiological conviction had practical consequences. There was no question not to recognize foreign Protestant ministers who came from churches without bishops and therefore who had ministers who were not ordained by bishops as such. There was never a question not to recognize their ministry and their ordination, because episcopal ordination was a matter of the well-being but not of the being of the church. So people like Peter Martyr, John Lasky from Poland, the French refugees and others who came to England and served the English church, for them there was no need to get an ordination by a bishop after they had been ordained by other parish pastors. So it was to be 4 generations afterwards. Yet, at the same time, later in the 16th century, other voices made themselves heard. 1589, Richard Bancroft, who would later on follow Whitgift as Archbishop of Canterbury, preached that, quotation, "In the Church of England, episcopacy is of divine right, jure divino." And more English theologians from the end of the 16th century started writing and speaking like this. Episcopacy for them was an apostolic must. However, they always added a must in England. The consequence was that they wouldn't let men serve in the Church of England who came from a continental Protestant church without diocesan bishops and therefore without episcopal ordinations, but who had been ordained by other clergy, by other presbyters or pastors. But still, this did not mean not to recognize them as such and their home churches as churches. They were just as fully churches as the Church of England, and their ordained ministry was just as fully ordained ministry as that of the Church of England. They just were not allowed to function in the realm of England. In England, they had to be ordained in the episcopal way, which, as the theologians always added, was of course the better way anyway, and the older way, the more ancient way, and therefore it was meet and right to keep it. Even William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury 2 decades later, a staunch enemy, as everybody knows, of the Puritan church order, who was deeply convinced of the divine right of episcopacy, even Laud nowhere denied the validity of the ordination in the continental Reformed churches where ministers had not been ordained in an episcopal way. What was new, however, was a growing conviction that episcopacy was a different degree of ministry, entailing a higher amount of grace compared to the normal ordained ministry. And this higher amount of grace and special degree of ministry could only be conferred through other bishops who already had this higher degree and this special amount of grace. Therefore, only a bishop would be able to ordain. So this was a growing conviction now in the Church of England from about 1600, 1610. In other words, whereas so far the whole question was a matter of right ordering of the church and its ministry, now it became a matter of the church's essence, of the church's being. It was clear, if this conviction became official doctrine, the ministry of non-episcopal churches would not be considered valid anymore. The recognition of non-episcopal churches as churches would become questionable. For decades, this question was left undecided. Yet the deadly fight with the Puritans in the Cromwellian period tilted the balance. The restoration of the monarchy underlined the principle no bishops, no kings, with the firmest possible fortification of episcopacy. The ordinal was amended. Henceforth, it left no doubt that the consecration of bishops meant lifting them to a different degree of ministry. Receive the Holy Ghost for the office and work of a bishop, it sounded henceforth, whereas before it was for the stirring of the grace already in you. And secondly, the preface of the ordinal explicitly said, nobody is allowed to execute ecclesial office unless ordained by a bishop. However, even this stern sentence still says, Nobody in the Church of England. The Anglican Church would not be the Anglican Church if this issue were not a matter of ongoing discussion. Let us see what the new scholar bishop will contribute to this debate in the future. We look forward to it. Thank you very much.